All right, last chapter for The Scarlet Letter by Nathaniel Hawthorne. We are reading chapter 24 today, which is just called Conclusion. This is a kind of flash forward. It's like the epilogue. It's telling you where are they now? What happened to the characters after the final scene on the scaffold where Dimmesdale dies. All right. After many days, when time sufficed for the people to arrange their thoughts in reference to the foregoing scene, there was more than one account of what had been witnessed on the scaffold. Most of the spectators testified to having seen on the breast of the unhappy minister a scarlet letter, the very semblance of that worn by Hester Prynne, imprinted in the flesh. As regarded its origin, there were various explanations, all of which must necessarily have been conjectural. Some affirmed that the Reverend Mr. Dimmesdale, on the very day when Hester Prynne first wore her ignominious badge, had begun a course of penance, which he afterwards, in so many futile methods, followed out by inflicting a hideous torture on himself. Others contended that the stigma had not been produced until a long time subsequent, when old Roger Chillingworth, being a potent necromancer, had caused it to appear through the agency of magic and poisonous drugs. Others again, and those best able to appreciate the minister's peculiar sensibility and the wonderful operation of his spirit upon the body, whispered their belief that the awful symbol was the effect of the ever-active tooth of remorse, gnawing from the inmost heart outwardly, and at last manifesting heaven's dreadful judgment by the visible presence of the letter. The reader may choose among these theories. We have thrown all the light we could acquire upon the portent, and would gladly, now that it has done its office, erase its deep imprint out of our own brain, where long meditation has fixed it in very undesirable distinctness. Okay, so days later, and people have had time to process what they've seen on the scaffold. Many people say they saw a scarlet letter, a scarlet A, just like Hester's, on Dimmesdale's chest, like in the flesh. And there were three different versions of how it got there. Some believed that he punished himself and put it there, whether he carved it, tattooed it, we don't know, but he put it there as a sort of force or as a way of torturing himself, punishing himself. Others say that the letter came a little bit later and that it was put there through magic and poisonous drugs by Roger Chillingworth, so he caused it to appear. And then there's still another group that says that, this is my favorite, that it just sort of showed up, that it was, let me read it. It was an effect of the ever-active tooth of remorse gnawing from the inmost heart outwardly, and at last manifesting the judgment, heaven's dreadful judgment by the visible presence of the letter. So some believe that it showed up on its own, like as a form of karma from God, because of the remorse and the guilt that he felt. It like ate at him from the inside out, almost like a cancer, and until the letter appeared outwardly, what he was really feeling inside. But there's still another group. It is singular, nevertheless, that certain persons who were spectators of the whole scene and professed never once to have removed their eyes from the Reverend Mr. Dimmesdale, denied that there was any mark whatever on his breast, more than on a newborn infant's. Neither by their report had his dying words acknowledged, nor even remotely implied the slightest connection on his part with the guilt for which Hester Prynne had so long worn the scarlet letter. According to these highly respectable witnesses, the minister, conscious that he was dying, conscious also that the reverence of the multitude placed him already among saints and angels, had desired by yielding up his breath in the arms of that fallen woman to express to the world how utterly nugatory is the choicest of man's own righteousness. After exhausting life in his efforts for mankind's spiritual good, he had made the manner of his death a parable in order to impress on his admirers the mighty and mournful lesson that in the view of infinite purity we are sinners all alike. It was to teach him that the holiest among us, has but attained so far above his fellows as to discern more clearly the mercy which looks down, and repudiate more utterly the phantom of human merit, which would look aspiringly upward. Without disputing a truth so momentous, we must be allowed to consider this version of Mr. Dimmesdale's story as only an instance of that stubborn fidelity with which a man's friends, and especially a clergyman's, will sometimes uphold his character when proofs clear as the midday sunshine on the Scarlet Letter establish him a false and sin-stained creature of the dust. All right, so there is still another group of people, the people who were closest to him. They swear they watched the whole thing. They never took their eyes off of him, and they saw nothing. There was no mark on his chest. He didn't say anything about being in sin with Hester Prynne. He simply went up there to die in her arms, to make his death a parable, which is like a tale that you're supposed to learn a life lesson from, kind of thing. Like there's a moral to it, in order to teach people that even the most pure are still sinners all alike, and that's why he went up there. Now, the narrator does mention that we have to assume, or we have to admit, that this last explanation is an example of people doing what people do, which is sometimes, even when the facts are there, undeniable facts about people that we love, we tend to not want to see them. And so that's what they say is happening in this situation with Dimmesdale. The authority which we have chiefly followed, a manuscript of old date, drawn up from the verbal testimony of individuals, some of whom had known Hester Prynne, while others had heard the tale from contemporary witnesses, fully confirms the view taken in the foregoing pages. Among many morals which press upon us from the poor minister's miserable experience, we put only this into a sentence: be true, be true, be true. Show freely to the world, if not your worst, yet by some trait whereby the worst may be inferred. Okay, our narrator says this is the moral that they want you to take from this. Be true, be true, be true. Show freely to the world, if not your worst, yet some trait whereby the worst may be inferred. So be true to yourself. Be who you are. Don't try to hide it. Don't try to fake it. Let the world see you at your true. At your worst is what it says. In order to be really true, you have to let people see you at your worst. Nothing was more remarkable than the change which took place almost immediately after Mr. Dimmesdale's death in the appearance and demeanor of the old man known as Roger Chillingworth. All his strength and energy, all his vital and intellectual force, seemed at once to desert him, inasmuch that he positively withered up, shriveled away, and almost vanished from mortal sight like an uprooted weed that lies wilting in the sun. This unhappy man had made the very principle of his life to consist in the pursuit and systematic exercise of revenge. And when, by its completest triumph and consummation, that evil principle was left with no further material to support it, when, in short, there was no more devil's work on earth for him to do, it only remained for the unhumanized mortal to betake himself whither his master would find him tasks enough and pay him his wages duly. But to all these shadowy beings, so long our near acquaintances, as well Roger Chillingworth as his companions, we would fain be merciful. It is a curious subject of observation and inquiry, whether hatred and love be not the same thing at the bottom. Each in its utmost development supposes a high degree of intimacy and heart knowledge. Each renders one individual dependent for the food of his affections and spiritual life upon another. Each leaves the passionate lover, or the no less passionate hater, forlorn and desolate by the withdrawal of his subject. Philosophically considered, therefore, the two passions seem essentially the same, except that one happens to be seen in a celestial radiance and the other in a dusky and lurid glow. In the spiritual world, the old physician and the minister, mutual victims as they have been, may unawares have found their earthly stock of hatred and antipathy transmuted into golden love. So, what happens to Chillingworth? Well, within a year of Dimmesdale's death, Chillingworth um, also he disappears. Basically, he dies because he has nothing else to live for. His entire life, his existence was set on getting revenge for Dimmesdale and making him miserable. And now that Dimmesdale's gone, Chillingworth basically has nothing else to live for. So he's got to pay up his debt to his master, which would be the devil. Leaving this discussion apart, we have a matter of business to communicate to the reader. At old Roger Chillingworth's decease, which took place within the year, and by his last will and testament, of which Governor Bellingham and Reverend Mr. Wilson were executors, he bequeathed a very considerable amount of property, both here and in England, to little Pearl, the daughter of Hester Prynne. So Pearl, the elf child, the demon offspring, as some people up to that epoch persisted in considering her, became the richest heiress of her day in the New World. Not improbably, this circumstance wrought a very material change in the public estimation, and had the mother and child remained here, little Pearl, at a marriageable period of life, might have mingled her wild blood with the lineage of the devoutest Puritan among them all. But in no long time after the physician's death, the wearer of the Scarlet Letter disappeared, and Pearl along with her. For many years, though, a vague report would now and then find its way across the sea, like a shapeless piece of driftwood tossed ashore, with the initials of a name upon it. Yet no tidings of them, unquestionably authentic, were received. The story of the Scarlet Letter grew into a legend. Its spell, however, was still potent, and kept the scaffold awful where the poor minister had died, and likewise the cottage by the seashore where Hester Prynne had dwelt. Near this latter spot one afternoon, some children were at play when they beheld a tall woman in a gray robe approach the cottage door. In all those years it had never once been opened, but either she unlocked it, or the decaying wood and iron yielded to her hand, or she glided shadow-like through these impediments, and at all events went in. So after Chillingworth dies, he leaves everything in his will to Pearl. Why would he do that? Who else is he going to leave it to? Maybe he feels bad. Remember, he loved Hester. He wanted a family of his own. He couldn't have that. So he leaves everything to Pearl. She's the closest thing he has, I guess, to like a child, maybe like a stepchild, sort of, because they never really divorced, even though he takes on this new identity. And so Pearl becomes the richest heiress in New England. She could have stayed in Boston, and when she became old enough to marry, she probably could have married one of the richest, or not richest, one of the most devout Puritans, like the best of the best, because she has money now. But they don't. They leave. They disappear. No one hears from them for a while. And then one day, years later, some kids see a woman at Hester's cottage. On the threshold she paused, turned partly round, for perchance the idea of entering all alone and all so changed, the home of so intense a former life, was more dreary and desolate than even she could bear. But her hesitation was only for an instant, though long enough to display a scarlet letter on her breast. And Hester Prynne had returned, and taken up her long-forsaken shame. But where was little Pearl? If still alive, she must now have been in the flush and bloom of early womanhood. None knew, nor ever learned, with the fullness of perfect certainty, whether the elf child had gone thus untimely to a maiden grave, or whether her wild, rich nature had been softened and subdued, and made capable of a woman's gentle happiness. But through the remainder of Hester's life, there were indications that the recluse of the Scarlet Letter was the object of love and interest with some inhabitant of another land. Letters came with armorial seals upon them, though of bearings unknown to English heraldry. In the cottage there were articles of comfort and luxury, such as Hester never cared to use, but which only wealth could have purchased, and affection have imagined for her. There were trifles too, little ornaments, beautiful tokens of a continual remembrance, that must have been wrought by delicate fingers at the impulse of a fond heart. And once Hester was seen embroidering a baby garment with such a lavish richness of golden fancy as would have raised a public tumult had any infant thus appareled been shown to our sober-hued community. So nobody really knows. Hester's come back to Boston, and they say nobody really knows for sure what happened to Pearl. But what they do know is that Hester gets packages or gets mail from someone in a far-off land that obviously thinks of her and loves her. They don't know exactly where. She also has really fine things in her cottage, luxuries that she doesn't really seem to care about, but that someone with money, like money would have been required, expensive things. So it's implied that Pearl is, in fact, still alive and probably married and doing very well. It mentions Hester making some baby clothes, implying maybe a grandchild. Because it was so fancy that there's no way a child in Boston, the Puritan community, could have worn it. In fine, the gossips of that day believed, and Mr. Surveyor Pugh, who made investigations a century later, believed, that one of his recent successors in office, moreover, faithfully believes, that Pearl was not only alive, but married and happy, and mindful of her mother, and that she would have most joyfully have entertained that sad and lonely mother at her fireside. But there was a more real life for Hester Prynne here in New England than in that unknown region where Pearl had found a home. Here had been her sin, here her sorrow, and here was yet to be her penitence. She had returned, therefore, and resumed, of her own free will, for not the sternest magistrate of that iron period would have imposed it, resumed the symbol of which we have related so dark a tale. Never afterwards did it quit her bosom, but in the lapse of the toilsome, thoughtful, and self-devoted years that made up Hester's life, the Scarlet Letter ceased to be a stigma which attracted the world's scorn and bitterness, and became a type of something to be sorrowed over and looked upon with awe, yet with reverence too. And as Hester Prynne had no selfish ends, nor lived in any measure for her own profit and enjoyment, people brought all their sorrows and perplexities and besought her counsel as one who had herself gone through a mighty trouble. Women, more especially, in the continually recurring trials of wounded, wasted, wronged, misplaced, or erring in sinful passion, or with the dreary burden of a heart unyielded because unvalued and unsought, came to Hester's cottage, demanding why they were so wretched, and what the remedy. Hester comforted and counseled them as best she might. She assured them, too, of her firm belief that at some brighter period when the world should have grown ripe for it, in heaven's own time, a new truth would be revealed in order to establish the whole relation between man and woman on a surer ground of mutual happiness. Earlier in life, Hester had vainly imagined that she herself might be the destined prophetess, but had long since recognized the impossibility that any mission of divine and mysterious truth should be confided to a woman stained with sin, bowed down with shame, or even burdened with a lifelong sorrow. The angel and apostle of the coming revelation must be a woman indeed, but lofty, pure, and beautiful, and wise, moreover, not through dusky grief, but the ethereal medium of joy, and showing how sacred love should make us happy by the truest test of a life successful to such an end. Okay, so when Hester comes back, what does she do? More charity work. She counsels people, women in particular, who have troubles in love or passion. They come to her and ask for advice, and she counsels them and comforts them, tries to make them feel better. And it says that she assured them, too, that at some point in the future, the situation for women in society would be better. Remember, earlier in the book, Hester had questioned whether life was even worth living for women. And here it says that she's realized that she is not the one to make this change because of her sin, that there will be a woman who comes along to push for this change, but she's going to be a good woman who knows joy and love and sinlessness, I guess. Now, all of this makes sense because when Hawthorne was writing the book, this was in the midst of the push for women's suffrage. So he was obviously a sympathizer, very much an early feminist on some level. So that makes sense that he shows that in this book, even though it's set 200 years before that. So said Hester Prynne, and glanced her sad eyes downward at the Scarlet Letter. And after many, many years, a new grave was delved, near an old and sunken one, in that burial ground beside which King's Chapel has since been built. It was near that old and sunken grave, yet with a space between, as if the dust of the two sleepers had no right to mingle. Yet one tombstone served for both. All around there were monuments carved with armorial bearings, and on this simple slab of slate, as the curious investigator may still discern, and perplex himself with the purport, there appeared the semblance of an engraved escutcheon. It bore a device, a herald's wording of which might serve for a motto, and a brief description of our now concluded legend, so somber is it, and relieved only by one ever-glowing point of light gloomier than the shadow. On a field of sable, the letter A, jewels. So it says that Hester went on. She lived many, many years later. For many, many years, and then when she dies, they dig a grave next to an old one that's sunken, but with a little space between them. This, of course, would be Dimmesdale's grave, and they share a single tombstone. So a quick recap of your chapter. You have at the beginning speculation regarding Dimmesdale's chest. You should definitely know the different beliefs and the different explanations. Chillingworth dies within a year. He leaves everything to Pearl, which makes her rich. She, Hester and Pearl, then leave Boston. They kind of disappear. We don't know where they go. Years later, though, Hester returns. She goes to her cottage where she lived before. She puts on her Scarlet Letter by choice. There's no stigma left with it. The magistrates would not have required her to put it on. She just does. And so there's no stigma with it because people almost feel sorry for her. Like they feel bad that she's still so regretful, maybe. She resumes her charity work. She counsels young women in situations like her own, or just women who have issues with love or how they're treated. And she receives expensive gifts from this another land. We don't know exactly where. We assume that it's Pearl, who is living this very wealthy but also very happy life, apparently with a child, maybe. And then when Hester dies many years later, she's buried near Dimmesdale, and there is a single tombstone between them. So there's some irony in the way that they place the graves. They put them together, but they leave a space between them because it's as if the two should not actually be together, and yet they share one tombstone. So there's some, I don't know what word I want to use, but definitely irony involved in the placement of the graves. And that is the end of the book. Hope it made sense to you, and I hope you found all of these videos helpful.